Thank you all for coming today. It's my absolute pleasure to host my colleague Natasha Dolby for this talk on domestic sex trafficking of youth in Brazil. This is a project Natasha's been working on for some time with us at the Honda Center, and in her personal capacity. I had the extreme honor to travel with her early on in the project to Brazil. And so I'm really excited to hear her present today. I have read her report, which is available on our website, and I encourage you all to check that out after the talk. I'll give a quick bio of Natasha, and then she'll speak for probably about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A with you all. So definitely be thinking of your questions. So Natasha Dolby, in addition to being a research fellow with us at the Honda Center, she's the co-founder of a new organization called Freedom Forward, based up in San Francisco, that is working to end the exploitation of children here in the Bay Area, specifically in San Francisco. Prior to that, she has about a decade and a half of service in the philanthropy space, most notably working on financial analysis and program strategy. She's on the board of a number of human rights-focused organizations working on sort of general human rights issues at Human Rights Watch, and more specifically access to education for underserved youth at Beyond 12, and then working on domestic violence and sexual abuse with the organizations Asha Rising and ECPAT USA. She's also a member of the Council of Advocates for the Freedom Fund, which is one of the largest philanthropic funders in the anti-trafficking space. She is local. She's an alum both of the GSB, where she did her MBA, as well as a master's from the School of Education. So we're really pleased to have her back on campus. And with that, I'll turn it over to Natasha.
Hi, everybody. Boa tarde for the Brazilians that I heard in the group. It's nice to be here, and yeah, thanks for your interest in this topic. Let's see. Before we get started, I wanted to take a quick poll from the room. How many of you have studied or worked within the trafficking space? Great. What about gender-based violence or violence against women? Okay. And how many of you have studied or lived or are very familiar with Brazil? All right, great. So quick true or false to get us started. Show of hands. Number one, if an international border has not been crossed, it's not human trafficking. Professor, you cannot answer that question.
Okay. Got a thumbs up, thumbs down?
Thumbs up, thumbs down from the room. Thumbs down. All right, great. Everybody's way ahead of the general public. Sex trafficking affects more victims than labor trafficking. Thumbs up or thumbs down? Thumbs up. Okay. You're not so sure. It's false. Actually, 16 million people, the estimates, don't roll your eyes, are said to be forced labor versus 4.8 in sexual exploitation. And only women and girls can be trafficked. Thumbs up or down? Down for everybody. All right, so
Smart group.
very smart group. What we're going to be covering today is a quick definition on trafficking, the Brazilian context, who's being trafficked in Brazil, psychological impact, ACEs, and alternative tools. Menina Dança, which is the organization I spent some time observing in Brazil, and some recommendations. When I started at the Honda Center, this project a couple years ago, my paper, I had 3 goals. One was to assess the gaps in implementation of international and national commitments to protect child victims of sex trafficking in Brazil. Number 2, I wanted to consider the psychosocial effects of sex trafficking in children. And 3, I wanted to discuss the findings on alternative tools, specifically on dance movement therapy as an intervention for reintegration for kids. Then my paper concludes with some recommendations to civil society and the federal government in Brazil, as well as funders. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, I'm not going to bother with the mic. So this report was based on mixed methods, included a literature review, field observations in the city of Medina, Minas Gerais, and Rio de Janeiro, where I'm from, and qualitative data from a survey with 89 girls ages 6 to 22 who in the previous 12 months had attended programs at Menina Dança, this NGO that works with at-risk girls along this BR 116, which is dubbed as the exploitation highway in Brazil. And I used a modified version of the Adverse Childhood Experiences International Questionnaire, so that's the ACE questionnaire, which is basically just modified to be administered to children under 18. And the data was collected between July and end of August in 2016. This is about the only slide that I have with lots of words, and everything else, I don't have as many words. And this is basically the definition from the Palermo Protocol, which defines trafficking, and this was written in the city of Palermo, Italy in the year 2000. And can I actually have a volunteer to read this out loud, whoever has good eyes?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Trafficking is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Exploitation shall include, at minimum, the exploitation of prostitution, of others, or of other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs.
And notably, thank you, Penelope, and notably this definition does not necessarily require movement. And even when the definition does address movement of the victim with the words transfer, transport, or receipt, there's no specification that this movement has to be across borders, which is particularly relevant given the prevalence of internal trafficking within Brazil. There's further in the Palermo Protocol, the notes that the consent of a victim of trafficking persons to the intent of exploitation described in the above definition is irrelevant when any of the means described in the definition have been employed. There's more specificity around protection of children, which basically says that the crime requires only action, movement, sales, or receipt carried out for the purpose of exploitation. It does not necessarily establish means such as deception, coercion, or abuse of power to be characterized as human trafficking. There are no exceptions to this rule, and if you ever hear somebody say again, child prostitute, you slap them in the hand. Those words cannot go together. So Brazil ratified this protocol in 2004, but not surprisingly, its implementation remains very weak. There's still a lot of confusion around the roles and responsibilities of different agencies. There are incongruent international and national legislation overlapping, and between policies that address slave labor versus those that address trafficking. In short, trafficking is a product of extreme vulnerability, arising from a number of co-occurring factors, including social exclusion, income shocks, illiteracy, state instability, migration patterns, high levels of judicial corruption, insecure immigration status, to name a few. And in Brazil particularly, It is fueled by an imbalance of power, extreme economic insecurity, corruption, and regressive social norms. So a little more in the Brazilian context. Jesse, don't roll your eyes. But so the population of Brazil is about 209 million people, and estimates put the number of kids at about 500,000. These numbers are cited by the United Nations, but also by Brazilian institutions called Center for Reference Studies for Children and Adolescents and Libertad. Also in the global context, because I cited those numbers before, global modern slavery paints the picture currently of 40.3 million, which includes forced marriages in that picture. So 25% of that general number are children. A little bit on the Brazilian law. So Brazilian law defines trabalho escravo, or slave labor, as forced labor or labor performed during exhausting working days and degrading work conditions. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but the specificity of the language ends up creating, even though Brazil has signed this protocol, but creating an inconsistency between the two. In Brazil, if you ask folks, is Brazil doing anything to combat modern slavery? And most people say yes. Brazil's on the news often on the slave labor front and labor trafficking. Brazil has a dirty list, which is a public forum registry of employers who have used slave labor in their operations, and this is a name and shame strategy with mixed results. And there's also a very popular special mobile inspection unit deployed by the federal government, and they storm into farms and factories and agricultural large-scale industrial complex for the same reason. And then those employers end up on this list, and you can imagine that then it becomes like a political fight of who's on the list and who's not on the list. So Brazil's praised in the international context because of those elements, but doing very little for its own children at home. If you ask a average Brazilian citizen, is trafficking happening in Brazil? First of all, let's say, is trafficking happening? They'll say, yes, absolutely. And a soap opera in Brazil made this very popular a few years ago, where young women would take jobs in Israel or Spain or abroad, and then have their passports confiscated and be in these situations of extreme exploitation. So the average Brazilian citizen identifies that as a trafficking scenario. They're less willing to think of a 17-year-old who is constantly sold domestically in their own city as a victim. Okay, so who is being trafficked? The majority of victims of sex trafficking in Brazil are female and from situations of extreme poverty in a context of social exclusion. The financial proposition is a factor in the recruitment of these young women who often, because of a basic survival and a desire to escape their current reality, is often the driver when they accept and are lured into these situations of exploitation. Often they are under physical or psychological threat. In general, they come from very poor communities, have low educational levels, live in peripheral or marginalized communities with a lack of sanitation or transportation, and often live with another family member, often have children of their own, have other children in the household. Most have suffered some intrafamilial trauma, sexual abuse, rape, sexual assault, or negligence in their lifetime. obviously there isn't just one narrative of sex trafficking in Brazil, of girls and boys, and there is actually current a lot of debate internally of the role of victimhood versus agency in as you walk into these situations to begin with. And I think the conversation is beyond the scope of this presentation and beyond the scope of my paper particularly, but I think what's important to highlight is the economic fragility in which that they're making these decisions from, if there are decisions. And I think the context of this context of extreme economic vulnerability is even amplified even more because of gender disparities in the country, and particularly for limited income gaming opportunities for girls, for young girls, young women. So I'm going to tell you a quick story. Her face is obviously covered. Her name is Renata. Renata comes from Medina, the city that I talked to you about, and the town sits along this exploitation highway I mentioned earlier, and it sort of cuts Brazil north to south. In fact, the way the highway runs, it cuts the city in half with the poor. The city's already very poor, but with the poorer side of the city on the other side of the highway, where sewers run open. In this town, I walked around for several days. There were no playgrounds. There were two sort of fields, one with some sort of benches around the main town, and the other one sort of like a soccer field but with random posts and things like that. Town has several Christian evangelical churches, and basically that it's churches and drug trafficking are the two things that happen in the city. There's sort of no middle line. Renata has lived with two grandparents and occasionally her mother in this one bedroom sort of makeshift home since she was very little, and her dad was then killed by the drug gangs locally. Renata was raped by her grandfather at the age of 9, and the abuse continued for about 3 years. So at the age of 12, she met a man who was 25 and who she called her boyfriend. And at first he was very nice, and what she thought he showed her love and affection. He also promised her to get her out of the situation from home where her grandfather was abusing her. Then fast forward a little bit in their relationship, he said, well, I can't really do this, you need to earn some money. And every single night he would make her walk to this dark part of this highway where traffic slowed down, and she would she'd sell her body for money, which she would then give it to him. Part of this process, she became addicted to drugs, and not only started using them, but also started selling them when she was, so at 14, she's basically now pregnant, addicted to drugs. When she was going to one of her prenatal appointments at a clinic, this social worker connected her to this NGO that I mentioned before called Menina Dança, and it took the executive director of this organization about 3 years to gain her trust and slowly help her kind of piece her life back together. I wish that this was a happy ending to the story. There really isn't. I tell you, because the prospects for her to raise now her 2 children with the intense amount of trauma that she carries is nearly impossible. But seeing her dance and seeing her levity when she was not speaking and not interacting with another adult was just, it was what gave me hope. And she's just one of the many girls in this town. I'm going to show you this quick video, and as a minute video is in Portuguese, so I apologize. I'm going to repeat the facts they say after, but I think you understand.
Cerca de 500.000 crianças e adolescentes são explorados sexualmente no Brasil. A maioria delas tem entre 7 e 14 anos. Estima-se que a cada 24 horas, 320 crianças sejam exploradas em todo o país. Só 7 em cada 100 casos são denunciados. E nas rodovias federais, existem cerca de 2.000 pontos de exploração sexual de meninos e meninas. Exploração sexual de crianças e adolescentes. Os números assustam. Um número salvo. Diz que 100 e denuncie. Sua atitude pode salvar uma vida.
So this is a fairly recent campaign. So the numbers they give is, again, the 500,000 estimated victims. Only 7 in about an estimated 100 cases is actually reported. You mentioned the 2,000 different locations mapped along the Brazilian federal highways as known points where youth is being sold. In each 24 hours, approximately 320 children are abused. At the end of the video, you saw, which I find it very ironic, that this Disque saying, dial 100, is saves lives, and I say that, with a heavy heart, because I wish it did, but it doesn't. It's the only hotline in Brazil, but it's not specific for trafficking. It's for any human rights violations. So if you think your neighbor painted a racial slur in your front door, like, that would go to the same number. And as you can imagine, the people answering these calls couldn't possibly be trained in any of the things that we know matter when survivors first call. So what we think happens is when you call, if you're the only way that it potentially could work is if it's somebody saying, I think a child is being sold at this particular establishment, for law enforcement to be deployed. But it's not like connecting it to a social worker to be deployed. It's completely and solely from a criminal lens standpoint. Which I think, if you're talking about being hopeful for the future, I think this is a great opportunity for Brazil to start shifting from only criminal justice perspective and law enforcement perspective on tips coming in, but also from mental health and healing in the long term. Let's see. Oh, I did something. No. So that's oh. Sorry, this is not my computer. More.
But it's changing the slides.
Sorry, miss. There you go.
Sorry, but I don't know where. Oh, that's
okay.
one. That's fine. There's no more.
Okay. So, very quickly on language, I mentioned before the terminology in Brazil and how people use commercial sexual exploitation, child prostitution, trafficking, modern slavery, child abuse, all mumbo jumbo. And in Brazil, I mean, this happens in the US too, so Brazil's not unique to that. But I think what was most alarming to me during my many interviews was people that should know better would say to me, oh, but that's not, it's child abuse. And I'm like, yes, but it's a systemic, if you're just calling it child abuse, you're missing the larger picture of the systemic structure really behind it, and you're looking at child abuse from an individual standpoint lens, which was very interesting. I think it personally, and this is my opinion, I think it hinders the application, the development and application of public policies in Brazil involving international bodies, local bodies, because the definition is so fragmented, and so there's not one voice yet around that conversation. Let's see, what else I wanted to say about the slide. I think it also continues to lead to the victims becoming more and more invisible rather than visible. I think they are overlooked by officials and who are legally, as you saw from the slide on the Palermo Protocol, obligated to identify and assist them under international law. They fall through policy cracks, and rarely, if ever, they receive the assistance that they need. Okay, so this list is not exclusive. I'm sure if we brainstorm long enough, we can come up with other determinants, but these are some that were most obvious to me and that I highlighted in my paper. So extreme economic disparities and lack of social mobility. We know that 30% of Brazil's population is younger than 15 years old, and 45% of those are living in extreme poverty in this age group. There are very limited income earning opportunities for youth from low-income backgrounds in general. Number two, the deep-rooted historical racism, of course, is no surprise. The vast majorities of girls and boys being sold for sex in Brazil are Afro-descendants. Most of whom are girls between the ages of 15 and 24. Slavery in Brazil, just as a historical context, lasted for 3 centuries, from the start of the 16th century to mid-19th century, and a period in which 5 million slaves were shipped from Africa to Brazil, which is 11 more times than what the U.S. Received. And Brazil was also, sadly, the last nation to abolish slavery in 1888. And not surprisingly, many Afro-Brazilians are still in the margins of society today. Almost 70% of people living in extreme poverty are Afro-descendants. Bullet number 3 are cultural norms that sexualize girls. I mean, this is not, I'm sure, not a surprise to many of you, especially those of you who are from Brazil. Brazil's cultural norms are deeply, deeply rooted in patriarchal norms, impunity, and economic disparities. I mean, that's how the country was founded. Telenovelas, as I mentioned, continue to reinforce some of those notions, and I think really do have an effect on the overall perception of Brazilian society in terms of beauty, in terms of role of women and girls, and the hypersexualization of girls from a very young age. Just 2 quick facts that I think are worth mentioning. In 2013, a survey by construction workers in Brazil from Childhood Brazil, which is a leading organization working in the protection of the rights of children in Brazil, confirmed 57% of respondents, meaning male workers in several construction sites around Brazil, confirmed that children were being exploited around their construction site that they knew of. And 25% of them admitted to having had sex 1 or more times with them. And in their eyes, the survey said consistently, respondents said, "Oh, better me because I'm the nice guy than him," right? Like, it was consistently that. Like, that's going to happen anyway. Might as well be me. And then another study from 2012 by Instituto Brasil-Estados Unidos, which is a DC-based organization, with 77% of men respondents, these are Brazilian men in with all sorts of background, thought it was common to have sex with somebody under 18. It was like, no, this is not a crime. Just as also background check, Brazil is the 4th country in the world in terms of early adolescent marriage, which is crazy to think. I mean, you'd think that certainly we would be below the number 10, but no, we're 4th, sadly. Cultural norms that accept violence against women, again, this is no surprise. It's on the news all the time. I think the latest reports is that a rape is reported every 11 minutes. So you can imagine how many are actually happening. Technology as an enabler. This is sort of a new one. So the Wall Street Journal calls Brazil the social media capital of the universe. We have, on WhatsApp alone, we have over 100 million users in Brazil, 90% of whom have mobile phones. This has obviously enabled sellers and buyers to connect at much faster rates. And in fact, if you Google WhatsApp Brazil sex, I mean, just the amount of images that will come up is overwhelming to the eye. And then this lack of trust in the justice system and corruption and this culture of impunity. 50% of Brazilians don't believe the judicial system works at all. And extrajudicial killings from the police that are never charged or investigated add to this belief that why should I call just saying like to report this? Nothing is going to happen. Nothing is going to come of it. Okay, thank you. So I wanted to throw the TIP report, Trafficking Person Report, which is the U.S. perspective on how Brazil is doing addressing trafficking. So it's an annual report, for those of you that don't know, issued by the U.S. State Department Office to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. It ranks governments around the world based on their perceived efforts to acknowledge and combat human trafficking. I'm going to read just a few bullets on the Brazil portion of the report because I think it highlights some of this conversation. So Brazil is a source, transit, and destination country for men, women, and children subjected to sex trafficking and forced labor. Child sex tourism remains a problem, particularly in resort and coastal areas in northern Brazil. Brazilian women and children, as well as girls from other countries in the region, are exploited in domestic servitude, which we didn't even talk about that. NGOs and officials report some police officers tolerate children are exploited in sex trafficking, patronize brothels, and rob and assault women in sex work, impeding the proactive identification of sex trafficking victims. Investigation and prosecution efforts in sex trafficking cases remain very weak. Reports of official complicity and corruption were largely unaddressed. And the recommendation, not surprisingly, is that Brazil should increase funding for specialized services, including housing for victims of sex trafficking and forced labor, improving federal and state law enforcement cooperation and communication on trafficking cases, increase specialized services for child sex trafficking victims, and including the case management assistance and oversight of local guardianship councils, which in Brazil they call them conselhos tutelares. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more in the next slide on that. Another point in the report from the U.S. is basically the government, as I mentioned, treats forced labor as this distinct crime from sex trafficking, and which results in this uneven interagency coordination and efforts. Basically, that's so. Children guardianship councils, conselhos tutelares, very briefly, in 1990, which was a year after the ratification of the 1989 United Nations Conventions of the Rights of the Child, Brazil passed this statute of children and adolescents, which became known in Brazil as ECA. So this was passed into law as part of the formation of a very progressive Brazilian constitution in 1990. Granted that Brazil had just been exiting years of military dictatorship. So ECA represented a sort of a profound philosophical modification for the first time in Brazil, where, imagine, children were looked upon from 1990 forward as human beings and having their full rights. And at the time, it was acknowledged as one of the most progressive legislation in the world, but as you can imagine, from paper to practice, there's a huge space in between, and I think also a huge space for opportunity in terms of the ECA's implementation. So these CGCs are, so Brazil is divided in 5,570 municipalities, and there are 5,904 councils, meaning for larger municipalities there are more than one household serving children. These are potentially strategic in terms of guaranteeing the rights of the child, because they are permanent, they are autonomous, and they operate at this capillary level all throughout Brazil. And I feel, in terms of looking forward, they could be a critical partner in implementing and ensuring the rights of the child, specifically around trafficking, are at the forefront. I mean, I added this picture because talk about data information systems, like just in terms of being able to look at data and trend analysis and understand what's happening. This is how we're looking at the data, like in 5,000 of these across Brazil. So to say that nobody knows what's going on is a fair and precise statement. Let's see.
Not to mention we couldn't even find some of them when we looked.
Exactly. I mean, the websites of where they were located and where they were in the actual world were not the same, and we showed up at several that were closed during, when they're supposed to be open at regular business hours. So what is the psychological impact of trafficking on children? Not surprisingly, trafficking has a profound long-term impact on health and well-being of children as the result of this psychological abused and pressure that they're in for the period that they are in these situations of extreme exploitation. The infliction of physical injuries and their psychological impact are often intertwined. And indeed, interpersonal physical violence often includes a psychological component. Psychological control ranging from emotional manipulation to threats of violence or witnessing violence against others may cause a range of issues from anxiety to self-harm to suicide to PTSD, and you name it. Obviously, children and adolescents are particularly vulnerable to trauma because their brains are not fully developed. During childhood, new neural pathways, and I'm not a neuroscientist, and interconnections in the brain form, and they're constantly being shaped by their experiences. When these experiences involve trauma, the brain cannot learn new information because it's basically a focus on avoiding harm and danger at all times. And so the body, your brain, is operating in this extreme toxic environment at all times, which obviously takes a toll on that child forever. So because I used the survey, the ACE model survey, I'm going to spend 2 seconds, and I know we're starting to run a little time, rush through, talking faster. So adverse childhood experiences refer to the most intensive and frequently occurring sources of stress that children can suffer. These experiences include multiple types of abuse, neglect, violence between parents and caregivers, and other household or contextual violence. ACEs are biological stressors that disrupt the human neurological development and in turn interfere with cognition and behavior. So neuroscience has shown that children who experience adversity can have this physiological toxic stress response that inhibits their brain from developing compromised functioning and compromises their immune system. So individual ACEs have a cumulative effect that can be expressed as the sum of ACEs as an individual exposed to or traumatized. So we know that the higher the ACE that any given individual has, you have an increased likelihood to develop heart disease, chronic lung disease, liver disease, and others. So for this study, this is this one girl taking our survey. As again, we collected 89 of them. And there were 10 types of childhood trauma measured in the ACE survey. 5 are personal, as I said, physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, and emotional neglect. And 5 are related to other family members or contextual environment. Parent who's an alcoholic, mother who's a victim of domestic violence, a family member in jail, family member diagnosed with a mental illness, and the disappearance of a parent through divorce, death, or abandonment. So again, as I said, these are cumulative scores. So of the 89 responses we received, 95% of the responses had an ACE score of 4 or higher. And which is, I was surprised, I mean, I was shocked. 95% of the 89 that had such a high score. And then I wish I had the breakdown of how many had it, but I think it was over 30% had a, right? Yeah. Had a ACE score of more than 7, which was, you know, it's a public health crisis in the background. Okay, so what can we do? I think, so obviously all of us, but particularly young people, need a safe and secure environment where they can access social and emotional support, education, play, and not surprisingly, this is very, this has a key role in their healing journey. This is not unique to Brazil, and I think we need to understand mental health needs of survivors at a global scale, and there are researchers doing amazing work on this area, especially in countries in low resource settings like Brazil, where the number of psychiatrists and psychologists, part of the structure of healthcare in Brazil, is fragmented and very small compared to the general population of what we would need. But I think that there's an opportunity for some of these less expensive interventions, like dance movement therapy as an example. So these are just some alternative tools. Somatic interventions for children and adolescents don't depend on verbal expression by the client. And movement-based therapy helps in long-term self-regulation, and for the first time, for the child, gives the body a voice of their own that's disassociated from words and the verbal expression of language. Not surprisingly, the body in many victims or survivors express that their body is a continuous source of suffering and shame. And so dance movement therapy helps break down some of that internal image for the self, and helps to connect the body, mind, continue again in a positive light. So this is basically the facade of the organization. I think particularly for Brazil, where is a culture that dance being a creative process at the forefront of Brazilian culture, and it's included in ritual and sort of daily life. And being able to see this with my own eyes and see how these young women could just relax and just be was transformational, and again, over and over felt like these young women felt like their body had a voice. So my recommendations for this were, as I mentioned, like I think there's a role for, so before I go into recommendations, just the broad strokes in terms of key findings for the time that I spent on this was the ineffectiveness of public policies under this ECA in Brazil. That was obvious to me. The close correlation between extreme economic vulnerability and a young woman being exploited. This non-differentiation between child abuse and sex trafficking is, I think, a potential for opportunity for the future. And yes, so those are my sort of 3 takeaways. And I think all those things add to the invisibility of the problem and to the lack of support that victims get. My recommendations were for us to rethink the role of the Conselhos Tutelares, the CGCs, in combating sex trafficking. I think beyond equipping these CGCs with infrastructure, but also capacity building of its staff, and removing the political process of who gets elected to run these offices. Right now is sort of your first step into public office, which would be sort of the equivalent of running for your board of school board locally. I mean, it is a election based of who gets in, but it becomes there's no requirement that anybody who's elected into these offices has any child development background, has any education background or health background at all. So you end up with people that don't know anything about children or children development. Again, I think the intention behind it was, anybody can become, these are our children, and we all should care about them, but I think it has backfired in the way that the structure was set up. And again, to the sort of the professionalization and capacity training of the staff, I think is a key point of opportunity. I think they need to see that these are not, again, separate incidences of child abuse, but that there's a systemic problem beneath it, and we're not even capturing that at all. No trend analysis for that. Improve this Dishki saying, the hotline. We, both in terms of collecting data, sharing data, and analyzing data, and of who is calling in, but also in terms of what happens to this repository of calls, like other than giving this information to law enforcement. This information also, in my mind, needs to be connected to international efforts on trafficking and other international hotlines. My last recommendation was sort of investing in other alternative treatment interventions for children and trauma survivors. Sorry I'm running over. Thank you for your interest and your time. I'm happy to answer any questions. And
Thanks, Natasha. 2 points I think that I wanted to emphasize that came up in your talk are, one, the importance of history on this issue. It's not just because Professor Jalik is sitting right here. Though a quick shout out to her trafficking course. Maybe some of you are in it now, but she offers it every year with some other faculty. So please check that out if you're not aware of it. But you know, you brought up both the legacy of slavery as well as the impacts of the very recent military dictatorship on sort of the country's social and developmental landscape. And then lastly, I think in the anti-trafficking space, it's always just really important to remember that the rescue is certainly not where this problem ends. By any means, I think we see a lot of romantic images of victims being rescued, and some of you were at our film screening on Tuesday of Ghost Fleet that show that to a degree, and I think Natasha's research really points to the need for continued support. And I would just recommend, if anyone wants to learn more about sort of these early childhood development and impacts of trauma, there's a book that I find very accessible to sort of the lay community called The Body Keeps the Score. It's a potentially somewhat controversial, the author, Dr. Vanderkolk, but it's, I find it just a really useful rundown of understanding how trauma can have both physiological and mental impacts that really can affect your entire lifetime.
Another plug in for another book of some local doctor, Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, who just published a book called The Deep Well, and she's doing, she has a TED Talk too. If you can't read the book, definitely watch the talk, but the toxic stress and high ACE scores in low-income populations, and how this is a public health crisis in this country too.